Hi and welcome back to sunny Grianan. After so many days filming on grey and cold and miserable days, it's so appropriate that the Grianan quilt, because Grianan is a sun temple, is now being shown to you in its complete form here on a gloriously sunny midsummer day in Donegal. So here goes. I don't have long enough arms, but you can see that it's now complete. We're now about to make the very last block for the quilt. It's actually a set of 4 identical corner blocks, but when put together they make a really attractive single block as well, so it's a very versatile little piece and it's lovely to me. It reminds me of the fuchsia flower, the double petals, and then the little centerpiece that comes down to a point. So it essentially uses a lot of the same skills as we've used in previous blocks, but on a smaller scale. And as I say in the pattern, the smaller the pieces, the more careful and precise we need to be. So I'm going to begin, as it says in the pattern, I'm going to make these little very, very tiny 4 patches. And you can see from my baby finger there that these 4 patch squares are made up of tiny squares that are only a ½ an inch square each. So the method that I use to make those makes it possible to get those lovely and clean and precise. So the elements that we need for these are the strips of fabric number 1 and number 8 together, and then number 6 and number 8 together. And I'm going to go off to the sewing machine now and sew those together. So I've stitched these together very carefully, very evenly, using, when I say scant 1/4 inch, I mean just on the 1/4 inch. You don't want a skinny 1/4 inch. You want it to be a fairly accurate 1/4 inch, but very sparing, because if you go off the accurate, these pieces will be too big and then they're not right either. And once you have them stitched together and pressed, the light towards the dark, which is fabric 6 towards number 8 and fabric 1 towards number 8, then you can just cut them into fairly equal halves, round about 5 inches in length. You only need 4 inches, so 5 inches gives you plenty of wriggle room. And you take the second part and put it back on top of the first part, so that this fold along the seam along the center, that you can actually feel that that actually snuggles in one within the other. Because if there's a gap there, there's a gap in the middle of your 4 patch where it opens or it appears open, and if there's an overlap, it's very clumsy and lumpy. So you just use your fingertips to feel that those are in the right place. And then the same again for the 1 and the 8. And then you see, if you can imagine taking individual little squares, cut 1 inch square, and trying to sew those together, it would be virtually impossible to get them stitched together accurately and evenly. And it's terribly sore on the joints in your fingers, even if you do manage to get it right. So this method, which is my own method, I've never seen it anywhere else, it's one I developed myself, allows you to get that accuracy without murdering your thumb joints and finger joints and your wrists. So I do the first line just inside one edge to establish a straight line, and then 4 times mark again at 1 inch intervals until I have prepared for 4 slices. 3, and this is an erasable friction type pen, so those lines will disappear, but in any case these lines are within the seam allowance and they're the lines that we'll be cutting on, so they'll disappear irrespective of whether it's an erasable pen or not. So for best results, put a little pin in at each end so that those don't move away from each other as you sew. Then you can take these to the sewing machine and sew them through, chain piecing one after the other until you have all your stitching done. So here you can see I've stitched 1/4 inch away from each of the 4 marked lines, not the first line because that's just your trimming straight line. And then we come in to trim. Before that, I want to mention, in the notes in your pattern, you'll see that I've mentioned to leave a little chain of stitches. It's just 2 or 3 stitches as you sew at the beginning and end of each seam. It protects the seams because these seams are very, very vulnerable to opening up. Those few stitches, if you can imagine, it's like a rope twirling on itself. It protects the seam until you get it into the next piece. So when you come to cut these, again, very carefully, and I discard the first piece before I cut the next piece so that I know I'm going an inch in to the line and that the seam that I've stitched is 3/4 of an inch in. And that way I know I'm sticking to the size that I need it to be. And that's my 4 slices. And when you open those, if we've got it right, that junction in the center should be absolutely spot on. And on the back, you can click them open like that and press them. Now, even with all the care that I've taken, I'm not just exactly sure that those are the size that I need them to be. And the size that I need them to be is 1.5 inches square. So I use my ruler again to take away even the tiniest bit of excess that there might be to give me a really neat, accurate square. And when I'm measuring this, I'm not just measuring the overall size, I'm measuring from the center divide, the middle of the block out. The complete little square is 1.5 inches square, so from the midline it should be 3/4 in every direction. And once you have 8 of those, 4 of this combination and 4 of this combination, you're ready to put those into your composition. Next, we want to make a set of 8 of these lovely, very small 1.5 inch square, half square triangles in a combination of fabric number 1, the background, and fabric number 6, which is that key blue or key note sort of zing fabric, depending on your fabric choice. And in order to make those in the pattern, I give you both the dimensions for this, the paper template method, and for the traditional method. If you're doing the traditional method, you take your 2 pieces that you find in your pack of fabric number 1 and fabric number 6, and you cut those down to 3 3/4 inch square. If you're using the paper template, you keep them the size that they are, and your paper template fits easily on top with generous excess all the way around to allow you to sew them. So I've gone ahead and stitched these because we've done this a few times now. In the last part 8 and part 9, we did different versions of these different sizes. Now we're right down to this very tiny size that will end up being 1 inch square when it's in the block. So I've stitched again. Now this is a little DIY piece that I've done on graph paper for you. It'll be included in your kit, but because I've done it myself, I've neglected to do the little crisscrosses. So please remember to do a little double stitch everywhere your seams are going to start and end, and that just protects those seams for you. So I'll show you now the way that I have been cutting through the paper to minimize the amount of work and maximize the accuracy. So I cut through the outline black lines first, but only within the paper, not going out to the edge of the paper, because then the paper surround holds everything in place until you get to the next stage. And the next stage will be to go, I've started to do this, I've taken part of the diagonal but not all of it. But you'll find the ways that work for you. But I find the longer the paper frame holds everything in place, the less troublesome it is. So now I can cut through this lower section, which releases these 2 guys, and they're already cut into their quarters. So after that, I complete the diagonals all the way out to the edge, and then turning the board, I go through this final line along there and just check that I have everything cut now. I knew there was one more line. These two guys. Do you see what I mean? Try to use the paper to keep everything in place rather than having little squares and half squares flying around the place, and you have to pick them all up individually and bring them back to cut them into halves or quarters. Now I can take the paper frame away complete, and I have all but that one cut along the lines and ready to lift my scissors, trim these, and once the little green box corners have been trimmed out, tear away the paper. Just being very careful with your seam ends, where hopefully you'll have remembered to do that little tiny double stitch at both ends to protect that. And if all of those parts of the sequence go right for you, you can now press to give you a lovely precise 1.5 inch square, and you'll have 8 of them from that set. Now the next thing that we need to do to complete this element of the block, and I call this the outer square, the outer 4 patch, is to create this little tiny corner guy. And this square, this one's a 1/2 inch square, this one completed is a 1/4 inch square, and that's just about as tiny as you can go without going into the world of miniature quilts. So in order to set that into place, I have made this element, which is a piece 2 1/4 this way by 2 1/2 that way. This piece is 2 1/4 by 3/4, and this piece is 3/4 square. Very fiddly sizes. So again, I do those in a group. So to make a group of them, I sew a strip of this, which is 3/4 inches wide, onto a strip of the background, which is 2 3/4 inches deep. Now, a few times when I've been doing this, what I found quite useful was to leave these pieces slightly big. So you could take a 2 1/2 inch piece if you've got one, and you could take an inch strip of your fabric number 8, do the stitching, press it, and then cut it to size. If you find these are too small to get precision, then work bigger and cut back to the size that you want. But for me, I find it handy enough to just add my 3/4 onto the 2 1/4, and I'm going to sew that now. So before I add this in now into the corner section of the block, I want to let you see this in detail and to point out the really important things. If you've got it right, you should still have a 1/4 inch seam allowance at that junction on all 4 sides. If you don't have that seam allowance, you're going to lose the point on these lovely petals, and that'll ruin the look of the block. On the reverse, you can see that the light is behind the dark, as we did it on the half square triangles, and then these 4 patches flip out onto their next door neighbours because that's the way they sit well. And then once those are all stitched together, I open up this middle seam to give you this rotating junction on all 4 of these places where the 4 patches meet, so that it lies flat and smooth. Once I'm happy with all of those things, I'm going to just give it a final check. It's a 2 1/2 inch square, so it should be 1 1/4 out from the junction in every direction. However, I'm not going to mess around with my seam allowance out there, so I will trim sparingly. And when you see that in your notes, it means trim only what's necessary. Don't do anything that will take away from your essential seam allowance unless you have no other option. And really all I'm doing here is cleaning it up, making it nice, clean square with no messy threads. And you can see the difference there. That's crisp, it's clean, and I still have my seam allowances. And that guy sits in place there. Now you can begin to see the formation. So I'm going back to the sewing machine to put together this 4-patch. Now you can really see this taking shape. I have stitched this together as a 4-patch, and I have tidied it up and trimmed it to be 4.5 inches square. That element at this stage measures 4.5 inches square. But again, as I trimmed from the outside, and I didn't do anything that affected my seam allowance here and here. Now we prepare these sets of outer petals, for want of a better word. These guys go on the end at this angle. And so for the shorter 2 petals, you have a rectangle that goes on that way and gets stitched across, and that's clearly marked on your pattern with a little red dotted line. Pay particular attention to the direction. If you do that diagonal in the wrong direction, it will not fit. You'll have a flower that's going in the other direction. So those guys go on, then the smaller ones go on in the same way. The diagonal marked this way, the diagonal marked that way, and then trim them. Just use the scissors to trim them. Press them out. I always press, even though it's the smaller piece, I press the light one back in underneath the dark, because if you're coming back to quilt that, you want to be able to come in nice and snug to where the light fabric is tucked in beneath the dark one, where it gives you a nice clean line. So that goes on there. And now to complete it, and I'm not even going to stitch this because you know exactly what it is that I'm doing. I want to go ahead and show you the quilt. So when you have 4 sets of these made and 4 sets of these made, you sew 1, 2, 3, 4 in that order, pressing towards the new addition every time, and once those are stitched, you'll have this, and you make 4 of those. And the other lovely thing about this block, although it isn't included in this quilt, is that if you put 4 of these together, you get the most gorgeous snowflake shape. So please feel free to experiment with this lovely fuchsia flower corner block. So finally, in glorious sunshine in Donegal, which is rare enough sight, on Midsummer Day, I am sharing the completed Grianan quilt top, and I have just put in place part 10, 4 of these cornerstones, which link in with part 8, part 9, and way back here log cabins that were part 4 and 5, to complete this composition, which the corners of the quilt are all about sort of light lines, like the sun lines, all leading towards this final corner piece. So where I left you last month was telling you to sew on the sets of borders as far as this point. So then this set is completed in both directions by the corner. Then in your instructions I tell you to add this lovely final sash that completes that grid of the sash that sort of unifies the quilt in a woven what would you call it? It'll come to me later. But it's the colour, the almost disappearing colour that it all sits against. And then to make it pop, this is the bit that I added, which is a little, I call it a Gillian border, because it was shared with me by a lady called Gillian, a lovely lady called Gillian, explained this border over the phone to me a couple of months ago, and I thought that would be a really nice addition, and it is, because without it, this would meet this, and that would be a lot duller than what we've got. So you fit this border in its entirety, and that will come to you all in one piece. There's no joins along that. The only place it joins is at the corners. And then this border is just an inch wide, and it sits above its neighbours, and then final outer border goes on. So if you want to see that, come into me a wee minute and I'll show you what that looks like in reverse. The grey of the sashing and the deep blue floral border meet underneath the little, and I call it a bead because it's like beading in furniture, which sits then above the background and just gives that definition. So now it's ready to go to the quilter.